Richardson, and my Cree name is Kinuisqueu, and I'm a member of the Métis Nation of Canada, which means that I have Cree and Gwich'in ancestry on my mother's side, and she comes from the community of Fort Chipewyan.
Welcome.
Thank you, Roxana. Do you want to say a word, and then I'll acknowledge the land, and we'll.
Well, I think that you are the guest to this program, and I'm so delighted that you have accepted this interview. It's really an honor for me. And I think we'll first have the land acknowledgement, then I will briefly introduce you.
Okay. So today I'm on the traditional unceded territory of the Abenaki people in what we call today southern Quebec in colonial terms, and near the border to Vermont. So of course, in many Indigenous traditions, we refer to this continent as Turtle Island, and I often say that I'm in northern Turtle Island, and that we have our own idea of lands and territories and paths of diaspora. And we live in the colonial society, which has imposed borders. So yeah, I'll just say I'm grateful to be a guest here. I spend a lot of time in Tiohtià:ke, known as Montreal, on the traditional territory of the Mohawk, the Haudenosaunee people. And as a Métis person, I do have Indigenous ancestry from the Northern Cree in Quebec, going back several generations. So I'm not completely detached from this land, but as part of the Métis Nation, my people really started out in this place and then followed the fur trade and moved west, finally to Fort Chipewyan, but also settling in Red River for a number of generations. So I'm a guest on this land, and as a guest, I have my own ethical responsibilities to be a good one and to treat the land and the people with respect and kindness and reverence.
Thank you so much, Kathy. Every time I hear you speak or I pick up a book, I feel I have so much to learn about history of Canada. Just to give a brief introduction, very, very brief, because Catherine has done many different works. She's currently Director of First People Studies, School of Community and Public Affairs at Concordia University. And she is the Associate Professor and Director of School of Community and Public Affairs, co-founder of Center for Response-Based Approach, founder of Métis Kick-Ass Women Educated of Montreal, adjunct professor, University of Victoria School of Social Work. I think if I was just to introduce you, we will miss this program, and I have a lot of questions to ask. It's just, she's also the author of many books, and this is her latest book, which I really love. Can you see? Oh.
It's fading in and out. It's called Facing the Mountain.
Facing the Mountain, yes. Bravo. It's a great book. It's like I read it and then reread it and then reread it.
Thank you.
Catherine, let me start by this question first. That, I mean, even yesterday there was this demonstrations in different parts of Canada, and there is this criticism about recently, after the discovery of the graves in particular, there is a critique of how the real history of Canada and colonization of First Nation people have been completely overlooked. And in some ways, you know, when this kind of progressive views, which I see in mainstream media, English, French, but also in Persian media. I see radical articles written about First Nation people, which really is the same narrative of the mainstream. And it kind of bothers me in a way, because when mainstream views and the progressive views become one, I know that there is a bigger story missing. So I'd like to see what's your views on the way that the whole issue of colonization of Canada in mainstream media and the alternative or progressive, I call them quasi-progressive because they really aren't progressive. They're just, they pretend more than they don't give you substantive views of what's really going on. So I'd like you to comment on that.
Yes, well, where to start? There's so much to say. So, well, what's really going on? Of course, there are thousands of Indigenous people on this land, populating this land, as well as the many archaeological layers of our ancestors whose literal DNA and bones make up the ground that we are all living on. And settlement has only really happened here for the past 150, 200 years. But Indigenous people have populated these lands since the beginning of human habitation. So we have that deep connection to place. And as I said, thousands of Indigenous people across the land who comprise many different nations, as well as peoples or tribal groups. And so there's no one unified voice about who we are and what we want. But that being said, I think a lot of people look on with surprise and with horror to the way these issues are being presented. So one thing I think of is many people, including myself, knew for decades and decades that there are bodies of babies, of children, under almost every every building that the dominant culture refers to as residential schools, because that's what the government called them. And more I appreciate now that I'm hearing the voices publicly saying they're not schools. Don't call them that. That is a disgusting euphemism. They were prison camps or resocialization camps. They were a place for child prisoners. They were not schools or residences. So that's one thing. We knew that many children were murdered. And if anyone cared to listen to the former internees, they would hear stories of horror about what it was like to watch other children get beaten and sometimes pushed down the stairs, or sometimes have needles pushed through their tongue for speaking their language, and being punished and publicly humiliated in all sorts of ways. So most children witnessed something like that, and many children experience something like that, including the very horrible events which we called like sexualized abuse, sexualized violence, as well as physical and emotional and spiritual violence. So that went on at all levels. And then to have that whitewashed, to just be reframed as, oh, some people had a bad time in those schools, it really distorts the accurate nature of colonial violence and what was really happening there. So we understand that. We understand that it was similar to slavery in a way. It was an attempt to create a population that would serve the upper middle class white Canadian families and state. girls were taught to cook for large numbers of people and to sew, and boys were taught to, to work with their hands, to work agriculturally, and maybe to work with, to build things, work in construction or logging or those kinds of, basic skills to work in industry. So it wasn't obviously the same as slavery. Of course, I'm not saying that, but it was to create a population of people like who would work in the basement on Downton Abbey, if you know what I mean, the downstairs laborers. That's what.
One of the things that bothers me is just this dark era, this dark history. It's like it's finished. It was then done, it's over. And that's one of the things that I think bothers me, especially when I read about the treatment of children in native only children hospitals, where children will be chained to beds. So this, I think a lot of people of European origin, even the Prime Minister said, oh yes, that's a dark part of our history. Yeah. It's not a part of history. It's part of the nation.
Yes, I think in the, the apology to residential school survivors, Prime Minister Harper referred to this as a sad chapter in our history, but it's not over. If it's only a chapter, we're still living in the book, it's not finished and closed up. And I think one aspect that we have to really understand about how genocidal and colonial practices are still at work is the targeting of Indigenous mothers. And even in the Indigenous community, more and more I hear people say, why are we only talking about missing, murdered women and girls? Because there are missing boys too, and men. And I agree, of course there are, and that's a tragedy and has to be looked into as well. But I think it is an important focus to look at women and mothering and motherhood, because that's the crux of the genocide. Is you take Indigenous women, you make them into indecent women, into women who engage in what men want. Okay, so prostitution sometimes, because you've impoverished them and made it so hard to live. So you push them into these, like you say, these dark spaces. Many women who go in to have babies are sterilized without their permission. And once they have babies, they're taken away by child welfare, still at alarming rates, much higher than during the so-called 60s scoop, when the social workers just went right in and removed all the children off reserves. And even today we have in Canada, and certainly Quebec is one of the least progressive provinces for this kind of practice, is they will target a baby of an Indigenous woman who was raised in foster care and say, because they were raised in foster care, we're going to remove that baby at birth. And even if there's family that says, no, you're not, and we'll make a safety plan, they still target the baby and then take the baby away. And then they make the family prove that they deserve to have their child back. And this is a violation of all sorts of international laws if you respect that Indigenous people are nations and we have, laws and protocols. And so the fact that this is all ignored, it's such a violation, and you couldn't get away with it in international law if you really respected Indigenous people at all. So the fact that we are trying to interfere with the childbearing practices of Indigenous women, it means you're trying to control the population, to lower the number of Indigenous people in Canada. So eventually, with the Indian Act and other racialized legislation pieces, that you will try to kill the Indigenous people. And of course, there's famous quotes about that. We want to kill the Indian and the child, assimilate everybody. We'll have no.
Please tell me who said that. We want to kill the Indian. It was the Prime
Duncan
Minister.
Campbell Scott was a
Yeah,
weird
yes,
guy. He
right.
was a poet, and I think he was like at one point the minister of education. He had a number of different portfolios, but he was told by Peter Bryce, the chief surgeon of Canada, you have to close down these residential schools because in some cases over 60% of the children are dying of tuberculosis. It's out of control, and they were not giving them injections or anything to help curb that disease. In fact, there's proof, again, we've had it for a long time, that they put healthy children in the same room with infected children. And he said, you have to close them. These children are dying at these terrible rates. And Duncan Campbell Scott uttered this quote, and we will not finish until we have dealt with the Indian problem. And so those guys, like people that think like that, they just wish that they'd killed us all off. And then they could just go ahead with, unchecked developing the mining, oil and gas extraction, the resources that hold up their little empires, right?
I'd like to come back to the mining industry because of Canada's record on the mining. But before I go on to that, maybe I can just tell you how, because this history is so hidden, so little talked about, so hush-hush, that before coming to Canada, and even in the early years of being in Canada, I knew absolutely nothing about Native Canadians. And Canada was presented, and still is in the world, as a country that, I'm going to use a Persian word, کشور بکر. It's an untouched, undiscovered land. So they want immigrants to come and populate the country. They want people with education and ideas and money to come and discover this country. And as an immigrant I come from a country that, at least in the late part of early part of 20th century, was semi-colonial by the same people who colonized Canada. But I saw no connection. There was no history. I was completely bought, and I see that our community has bought into this white colonial European narrative very profoundly, that I guess some of it is also related to identity politics, that this country is started like 200 years ago. And as an immigrant, perhaps I will be disowned, but we are forced to swear our allegiances to the Queen of England. That is mind-blowing. The fact that Queen of England and the British, who were with whom we had to fight for our own oil, here did the same in Canada. Yet when we come here, we have to, when we become an immigrant, we have to swear alliances to the Queen.
Well, Quebec would agree with you. They don't like to do that either. But yeah, you raise an important point. The history of colonization here is one of extraction, and so they've eliminated the people, the indigenous people who were, the so-called owners. We don't really believe in ownership in the European way, but the owners and caretakers of the land. It's like we were just here to be guides for them, and they came and took the animals, right, and the land and the minerals and the water. And so today, a really, really important aspect that indigenous people are fighting for is to have their water and clean water, and to continue working with the animals as they always have done. And it's so interesting because Europe has not been our friend. They completely joined with so-called progressive activists against the Inuit people, condemning them for their hunting practices, for hunting seal, and not knowing anything about how they did that and how it's a staple food for them. And so when they ban the seal hunting practice, for example, in Nunavut, then the poverty rates, they skyrocket because so many women made their living from processing seal meat, but also clothes. They made clothes. And so it's all right for Europeans to wear cowhide and leather jackets and be really cool, but it's not okay for other cultures to do that, and they cast them as barbarians. So it's just this ignorance about what they're actually doing as progressive people. But what I wanted to say earlier is, the foundations of Indigenous culture are holistic and include spirituality, as in many other places. And so many healing rituals involve some form of prayer. And I just wonder if, the little souls of those children finally were activated to kind of push themselves up and say, you cannot ignore us anymore. There's that saying that says, you have not defeated a people until the hearts of the women are on the ground. But I also wonder if these little ones were saying, we're here. And you cannot, we will not let you ignore us. And across the country, a wave. So starting off with 610, well, they call them graves. I don't know if they're remains or little bodies, but sweeping across the country, and over 4,000 now. And these children are being taken home. And so communities are, asking for support to do that. They want to bury their citizens on their own land. And so I think that's important to think about that. And again, people who are empathic and compassionate, they see themselves as allies. They might get sad and they might cry and say, oh, it's so sad. But, this has been happening in so many ways for so long. And also, maybe they could understand that these children are going home to their own nations. And if we're going to work with borders and passports, maybe Canadian settlers should have a passport and permission to enter Indigenous lands, and to make sure they don't use up all the resources when they go there, but leave it for the community. And getting back to the point you raised about, I wasn't taught this, when I was getting my citizenship papers. You received, a successful colonial integration into this country, just like Canadian children across the land receive a successful colonial education, where this is deliberately left off the books. The government doesn't want people to know the exact nature of the
book that they make us read about Canadian history. There is nothing about the history of Indigenous people. Anyone who emigrates should fully understand where she is settling in. Before I forget, I want to just mention about the reserves and how the reserves are now being violated, really. How nuclear waste of the Americans are being dumped there's all this nuclear proliferation and all that, but we don't realize that the nuclear waste of Americans are dumped in where people of First Nation live, and it's led to cancer. And I think that people around you who've suffered as a consequence.
Yes, I write about that in my book, The History of Canada in relation to uranium mining, and how the Indigenous people were, again, exploited on many levels in that process. But we look back to the 70s and the events at Pine Ridge Reserve in the United States, and how the FBI were involved, and the murders, and the people there, like in many communities, were just trying to keep their community safe, to keep the drinking water safe, to stop the tailing ponds, and to address, hunger and providing good food. Like even AIM, the American Indian Movement, they were basically social workers. I mean, they got involved in political fights, but their main role was to make sure that people were taken care of and had what they needed to live. It's just that things got heated up because they didn't want uranium waste in their lands, right?
But they didn't succeed.
Mm.
And many communities are suffering, not to mention access to clean water. I think something like 50 communities in Canada do not have access to clean water. Let me just take you back as our time is coming to an end, to the issue of artistic expressions, and how, because I see a lot of art exhibition, and certainly art has had a very major place in Indigenous people's life and culture. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about the healing power of art, especially the Indigenous art, in all forms and shapes that you can tell us about.
Yes, maybe in some way the material culture of Indigenous people is like a material or spiritual emissary, because it goes out into the world, and as in the art community, it's many wealthy people or banks and corporations that buy the expensive art, and they will display it on the wall. And it really, I think, it's just ironic that it ends up there, but when people see it, it really evokes the sense of a really different level of being, like the freedom of our spirit to be able to float in the sky with the geese or the clouds, to come across the faces of the ancestors there, or to resonate with the sun or the moon. And they really draw the natural world into so many forms. Indigenous artists do that. And so there's something about Indigenous cultures and worldview that I think travels with the art and speaks to a lot of people. And so if we really want to take that in a more spiritual and an ethical way, it's to take it further and make sure that the Indigenous people get paid properly for the art and for their contributions, and we don't take the ideas and work with them in other cultures. But what the healing part is for me is what the art is based on. So often Mother Earth herself, or the various elements, the wind, the waters. There's so many places where the waters appear. I mean, right now, just the how the wind carries the leaves away, like cleaning up autumn, getting ready for the next season. And there's something about that the life cycle, the cyclical nature of the natural world. And every day, whether we're aware of it or not, or whether we're Indigenous to somewhere, or a settler, or a person of a diaspora, we rely on the water to cleanse ourselves. And it's not just a physical cleansing, it's also the energy of the water in the waterfall, or in the shower, or in the pool, that cleans some aspects of our aura, or our spirit part of ourselves. And the water that we work with, we take in water to drink. We need clean water for healing. And then we express our pain through our tears, right? Or through sweating, as in a sweat lodge, or being in the sun on a vision quest, or the kind of thing going into a sauna, or riding a bike, or jogging. It's the water in our bodies that carries the emotions through us, according to many of the teachings that I received around healing. So that it's movement and energy and water, and we need that. And we need to cry, and we need to laugh, and we need to move and cleanse and work with rhythms and shaking, all these kinds. This is what helps us stay in balance. And
rooted.
The other part of it is that it needs to be collective. Like, we need to grieve collectively together, and we need to feel like part of a community, because part of the suffering is when we're isolated and alone. And that's what violence does. It severs the ties between people, between, mothers and children, between people and their, adults and their grandparents. It moves people around, and it causes mistrust. Here I'm speaking quite abstractly, but violence breaks us apart. And
pandemic breaks us apart.
Yes, the virus. So we need to try to stay together.
And that takes identity politics. That's right now is quite divisive. How identity politics has really set us separated in terms of how I identify ourselves, and then how I was watching a very interesting program on US, that how the white is now a minority. America is becoming white minority, and that's causing a lot of anxiety. That's why you see Trumpism, because in terms of identity politics, white have certain identity, blacks and natives and Middle Eastern, they all have different identities. And now there is this fear that the white identity may not longer be the dominant identity. And it fears that what it has done to other people will be done to itself. So part of the resistance that is trying to camouflage the history is that anxiety that white supremacy is on the fall. And there is this anxiety on the part of the white that what if we are going to be the minority, and what if as a minority, we will be treated the way we treated the other minorities. So that's certainly something on my mind.
Well, it's startling to me, because first of all, many people have that kind of religion that, has teachings. And if they just followed their teachings, we'd all be equal and it wouldn't matter. But they don't follow their teachings, right? And also, they come from Europe. It's not really like this was a red continent. So it's again, if you just think of me and this generation, this time, you don't have a chronological view. I heard this analysis that that's why, like, World War II was so shocking to a lot of people, because this was the first time that white people were doing to white people what they had been doing to people of color for generations before that. And that was okay for them. But when it was white people both involved, then the Allies came in, and it couldn't be okay. Then we had to stop this, whatever. So there's so much to say about that. But I think around what's really caused some discontent which lies underneath some identity politics are these notions of liberalism and individualism, because for a long time, certain groups of people have thought, we're free. I can do whatever I want. I can take whatever I want, and I'm just entitled. Like, just be free. You don't care. And then other people started saying, no, you can't take our ceremonies. You can't copy us and you can't copy our art. You are not free to take everything you want, you spoiled little kids. And so people bang up to that and they say, what do you mean? I can go into a new age store and I can buy sage and sweetgrass. And then we say, well, of course you can, but don't use it around us because that's not ethical for us. We have protocols. And for one thing, you're not supposed to sell that stuff. You're not supposed to take a profit. Things that help people heal, there are protocols around that, but money isn't part of it. And no, you can't have everything. You can't be so entitled. And so it's caused people to say, well, I'm going to get a group of people together and we're going to prove to you that we can have anything we want and we could still be in charge, right?
Yes. Yeah. Well, there's so much to say about all that. And I think for this section, I just want to wrap up around, if you were to just tell me how you felt when you saw all of a sudden all this huge outcry, which actually dying down probably soon, about Indigenous people's rights. How does that make you feel?
You know, when I see things like Idle No More and movements that say we have rights, well, I feel very proud. I feel happy. There's just little things. I'll have to tell you one thing that just gave me so much happiness last year. I think it was someone in my student community, no names mentioned, but they took a picture of a lawn chair, you know, a silly little old flimsy lawn chair. And it was called the lawn chair that stopped the train. So you remember where there were protests and people were stopping the trains? Yeah. And I thought that for me, that's very exciting. And then people have to, again, question, what do you mean I can't put my stuff on the train and have it go to Toronto to the stores? What do you mean? And again, it's that entitlement. And I thought if this was a revolution, they would open the train and give the food to the people that were all around there that were hungry. You know, we don't realize in a lot of these Indigenous communities and in city centers, there are actually people who are starving.
I was stunned that in parts of northern Quebec, a price of one apple is like $12 or $15, something ridiculous, yeah. Because it has to be transported by plane. Because of course, people's traditional ways of food has been disrupted. And now food has to be exported to these communities, and it's expensive, and people can't afford it. Other than cigarettes and alcohol, everything else on the reserve is very expensive. Yeah. I wish I had but a price of one apple was, this person who was going into this northern part of Quebec Indigenous community, he was in his suitcase, he was taking fresh fruit because he said there won't be any where I go.
Yeah, and he's used to that. And if we hadn't interfered with their food supply, they still would be eating fish from the water, maybe caribou, maybe seal. Like the water would be clean enough to produce these foods that people can eat. But now if they're all polluted from mining, you know, what are we going to do? So we find ourselves in this situation along with global warming, because we've all been flying around and driving our cars and doing all these things that we shouldn't have done, like eating so much cow meat for the last, decades. Yeah.
Among books that you have recommended to me, which I love, it was a biography of Maria Campbell, or was it your book? Maybe I'm mixing. there was this quote that it's just stuck into my head, that a white man leaves money in the bank as an inheritance, but an indigenous person is proud to how many trees leave for his or her community. So this is the huge difference we're talking about. So I want to thank you for this short interview, and maybe we follow up with the mining industry, because there's so much tied to the mining industry, and Canada probably has the worst, not probably, Canada does have the worst record in the mining sector. Thank you very
Yes,
much. And I'd like you to finish this interview with your insight and your wisdom.
Well, I'm so glad that I met you. We've known each other for maybe almost a year now, and I appreciate the dialogue we've been having. And I'll just share a brief story. A friend of mine who works in Vancouver in the downtown east side, Vicki Reynolds, she told this story of her work where there's a lot of members of the immigrant community there. And a lot of people came from Chile, in the 70s. And they would say, like, what's going on here and whose land we're on, because they were discovering this wasn't like all Canadian land, that there was something else. There were indigenous people here, and they wanted to know whose land are we on. And so they talked to people and they organized, and they wanted to have a ceremony. And so they asked if the local indigenous people would come, or the leaders, and they said, we want to have a ceremony to thank you for letting us come on your land. And that's the only time I've heard an actual group of people do a kind of nation to nation, I mean, they're individuals, but protocol saying, thank you for letting us be here.
So allow me to thank you for letting me and my family to be in your land. Thank you so much, Catherine, and I wish you a wonderful evening, and look forward to another interview. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.
I have all my relations.